Hello, Houston, and happy Fest attendees, probably from all over the world. And welcome to this session, which is entitled Impaired Vision, Lifting the Blindfold of Injustice, to talk about the film you just saw, Alternative Facts. My name is Hoyt Zia, and I have the privilege of being the moderator for this panel, which includes the film's maker and one of its stars. Before I go further, though, let me thank the Happy Fest organizers for including Alternative Facts among the films shown and for giving us the session to talk about the film. By sort of way of quick preview, this panel will be conducted as follows. I will be introducing the panelists shortly. They will give remarks, which will be followed by further discussion about the film. After which we will be fielding questions that you'll be submitting via the chat room. Without further ado, let me go start by introducing the panelists to you. First, we have John Osaki, the award-winning filmmaker of Alternative Facts. John is a native San Franciscan who earned his BA degree at San Francisco State and, as a filmmaker, has been directing and producing promotional, educational, narrative and documentary films. His initial interest in film grew from his desire to share the stories of his day job working with youth in the community at the Japanese Community Youth Council in San Francisco, Japantown. And he has been with the JCYC as its executive director since 1996. As a filmmaker, over the past few years, he has had films screened at film festivals and community events across the country. And as a filmmaker, John views this genre as the next step in his lifelong pursuit of social justice and equity. Alternative Facts recently won a couple of Telly Awards and was a finalist for the American Bar Association Silver Gavel Award for documentaries, an honor he shared as a finalist and receiving an honorable mention award with an HBO documentary about lawyer Brian Stevenson, whose life was featured in the recent film Just Mercy. So in terms of competition, congratulations to John. It's not too shabby, to say the least. Next, you will recognize our second panelist from the film, super lawyer Donald Tamaki, who is a native of Oakland, California, and who received his BA and law degree from the University of California, Berkeley. He is managing partner of Minami Tamaki, LLP in San Francisco, and in his own practice represents business and nonprofit clients. And he actually is a super lawyer, having been designated as such by those who decide these things for the last 17 years straight. His dedication to the Asian American communities started in college, if not even earlier, in high school. As those of you who saw John's film know, Don served on the legal team which reopened the 1944 U.S. Supreme Court case of Fred Korematsu and successfully overturned his criminal conviction for defying the removal of almost 120,000 Japanese Americans to concentration camps. Most recently, he is the 2020 American Bar Association Spirit of Excellence Award winner, which is just one of his many awards as a lawyer and community service activist. Finally, we have Heaven Chee, a native Houstonian who obtained her BA locally from Rice University and left Houston briefly to earn her law degree at the University of Virginia. After law school, Heaven clerked with the Honorable George C. Hanks Jr. of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Texas, and she is currently an associate with the Houston law firm Yetter Coleman, where her practice is focused on high-stakes commercial litigation and appeals. Heaven is very active in the Asian American Bar Association of Houston and the Houston Bar Association, where she is particularly focused on pro bono and community service work and increasing opportunities for minorities in the legal profession. She also serves on the board of Developments in Literacy USA. Okay, and so without further ado, let me ask John to provide his opening remarks about his film, how and why he made it, and its relevance to current events. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Hoyt, and thank you for everybody who logged in today and got a chance to see this film. I hope that everybody took something away from it, and just a little bit about how this project initially came about. My father was incarcerated at the Tule Lake Segregation Center. My mother was incarcerated at the Gila River concentration camp. And, growing up, I had an opportunity to see them receive their apology from the United States government for their incarceration during World War II. And so I think for me, for many years, I falsely thought enough was being done to educate our communities, our country about what happened during World War II. And then a number of things started to happen in more recent years related to my own children. And I think the most stark issue is that it became very clear to me that they were not learning about these vital chapters of American history in their classrooms. My daughter in particular came home very angry one day and shared with my wife and I that her history teacher had shared with the class that the concentration camps that Japanese Americans were placed in were like summer camps where everybody went to dances and played baseball. She was incensed because she knew better. She knew the stories from my mother and my father. And so, over a series of events, it became very clear to me that this country is starting to forget. And, the word that keeps popping into my head at this particular moment is oppression. And that during what really came to a head is that during the 2016 presidential election, a number of very oppressive policies were being contemplated, were being advocated for against Syrian refugees and Muslim Americans. And at that time, some of you may recall that a number of political pundits, public officials started to come forward and suggest that not only was the incarceration of Japanese Americans justified, but that it could serve as precedent for actions that we might have to take against groups today. And it was at that point that I started to really understand how not only has this country started to forget, but we've reached the point in our history where groups of people are actually weaponizing our history and manipulating the facts for their own political purposes. And so I felt adamantly at that point in time that I had to do something about it. And this film was me doing something about it.
Thanks, John. Let's turn over to Don Tamaki now. Don will talk about further about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, the Korematsu case itself, and why it all remains important today. Don?
Thank you, Hoyt, and thank you, OCA, and those attending this panel. First of all, it's obvious from the streets that we have to comment on what's going on today, which I think is a groundbreaking movement that we've not seen in 50 years. My family and parents were incarcerated in Topaz concentration camp and have, and since then, we've lived with and grown up in the shadow of these camps, and our message has been the danger of history repeating itself. At the same time, we're witnessing the consequences of 345 years of systematic racial discrimination. And while I grew up during the era of Jim Crow segregation and the Green Book and this sort of thing, which has changed, the culture of racism regrettably has continued. And what the latest incidents just reveals how important it is to change this culture. And I want to say that the aspects that allowed the incarceration of Japanese Americans, that gave birth to the Chinese Exclusion Act, that contributes to the racism and prejudice happening now has a common playbook. And it's used by political leaders globally in order to rise to power. That playbook is one, appeal to prejudice. Secondly, fearmonger and scapegoat. And thirdly, traffic in falsehoods, alternative facts, and conspiracy theories. And together, those things have shaped the culture, as I said, in America for the last 345 years. And while there's been a constant victimization of African Americans, throughout, Asian Americans have been regrettably part of that history too. The reopening of the Korematsu case that John's film illustrates really lays bare those features. The Japanese Americans were defined as an enemy race. And so pervasive was the culture of racism and prejudice that, notwithstanding every intelligence agency, FBI, the Federal Communications Commission, the Navy, and others weighing in officially, that there was no reason to round up and incarcerate these people. Facts and the Constitution simply didn't matter. And in the face of whistleblowers like Edward Ennis and John Burling that are illustrated in the film, at the highest levels of our government, they were ignored, and falsehoods and fabrications were presented to the Supreme Court in order to manipulate the outcome of those cases. For its court's part, which normally is the third branch of government and a check and balance on the abuse of power, the government invoked national security. And because of that, the court stood down. The court abdicated its traditional role to ask probing questions and basically let it all happen. Fast forward now in 2017, when Trump issued the first of thrice revised orders shutting down the border and separating families from Muslim majority countries. The court had an opportunity to review Korematsu versus the United States and take a different tact. But sadly, in 2018, in a 5-4 decision, the court stood down, essentially bowing to the will of the government's claim that the travel ban makes the country safer and is not simply the product of fulfilling campaign promises and racist policies. Now in the streets, we're all watching, finally, the consequence of this ignoring of warnings, of whistleblowing, of cries out from the community that this culture has to change. And so on the one hand, it's been sad that 345 years has passed, victimizing not just African Americans, but all other people of color in their communities. But it also creates an opportunity for the people, for example, listening in on this broadcast, to participate and not be bystanders to historical events. And so it presents both a tragedy and an opportunity. So I really appreciate OCA doing this festival.
Thanks, Don. Next, we have Heaven, who will talk about, sorry, Heaven, I keep saying that.
Okay.
We'll talk about how the film informed her perspective on her community service with the Houston Asian American community. Go ahead, Heaven.
Thank you, Hoyt, and thank you, everyone. It's an honor to share the digital stage with everyone here. I actually had the opportunity to meet Don last year, and we threw a somewhat similar event at the Asia Society with a different film. And last year, the topic was the Muslim ban, the travel ban that Don has just referenced. And it's eerie, no doubt, that about almost a year after that first time that Don and I had the opportunity to work together, that we're back again. And there's a new and equally jarring civil unrest that's happening in our country, and it's very close to home to all of us in Houston, because George Floyd, of course, is from here, and he'll be here on Tuesday to have his memorial in his hometown. And I think that I wanted to touch on something that Don said, which is that there's a common playbook for oppression, and there's certain tools that they always go back and rely on. And the tool that is most salient to me as an Asian American, and especially an Asian American who grew up in Houston, is the tool of divisiveness. And it is, in my opinion, the absolute strongest tool that the status quo wields. It's the strongest tool that anyone in power can wield. And it's used to convince us of our differentness. It's used to convince us that we are otherized, not just to those in power, but from each other. And the common discourse in the past years, thankfully, has picked up on this, but it's that we are realizing as Asian Americans that we are equally vulnerable just by virtue of how we look. We're visibly so different, and it leaves us vulnerable to things like rhetoric that the greatest health crisis in our generation was caused by the Wuhan virus, the China virus. It was cooked up in a lab by an Asian country. And we lost our Americanness and we lost our personhood just like that. And it doesn't matter how much we believe that we are part of this country or this culture. And we've been privileged to an extent that we've had the opportunity to have a lot of socioeconomic and academic and professional doors open for us. And that was part of the divisiveness, and that was part of the tool of the status quo, because we were convinced that we were other. And in this case, it was actually a positive stereotype. We were convinced that we were more worthy, we were more disciplined, we were more diligent, we were more, we rocked the boat less, and we were willing to achieve excellence, and that would protect us. That's the myth that we've all had the benefit of living under for the past few decades, and in my lifetime until fairly recently. And I think Mr. Floyd's death and the protests that are happening now have to serve as a stark reminder to even our local history. And we should all be very cognizant of this as Asian Americans, which is that we're simply treated differently. And I'm not talking about the kind of implicit subconscious biases, but here in Houston, my mother was actually born in Houston. My dad was born in New York, and he moved to Houston when he was 3 years old. They were born in the 1940s, so they grew up in the segregated South, effectively, by being here in Texas. But the segregated South in Texas looked very different. And like the Chinese who grew up in the Mississippi Delta, the Chinese in Houston went to white schools. So even though there was a black school and a white school, and my parents actually lived on Scott Street, about 10 minutes south of Yates High School, where Mr. Floyd attended high school, they went to white schools. Their opportunity was different. In the most American way, that opportunity could be different in education, in access to opportunities to both assimilate, to learn how to speak the language of passing, and to understand what the standards would be for our future in professional America, to break down some of the barriers of institutional racism. And my grandparents came over with the third grade education or less, and now they have grandchildren like me who are lawyers, doctors, engineers. And that was our myth. That was the way that we were used until recently. And I think right now that we're seeing absolutely just egregious injustice, we can't forget that that's where we came from. We were the very first exclusionary act to be implemented on immigration. We were the Americans that were put into camps, and I think we will face a serious risk in the future of being the villains of a geopolitical conflict. And we can't be complacent by being divided and comfortable in the narrative that's being told about us.
Thanks, Evan. Let me seize upon or segue into the first question I have for all three of you. The outpouring of demonstrations and protests in the last week or so have really been unprecedented in I think in our country's history. The killing of George Floyd appears to have created a real turning point in how America thinks about race, and particularly injustice to African Americans, which has never changed since slavery. Now, you've all talked about how Asian Americans need to support our fellow minorities. How do we, or what concrete actions can we take to make sure this turning point continues and doesn't just fade away into the background like so many other big issues that flare up or come up and then just kind of disappear without any action taken? What is the call to action that we as Asian Americans should take? and particularly if you have any specific thoughts and actions to suggest, that'd be great, because we need to have this. I think we need to have this conversation, this discussion, move from talk to action, and it may be the perfect time for doing so. What do you guys think?
Well, I can go first in responding to that, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about my day job. I've been running a child and youth development nonprofit in San Francisco for for the past 23 years, and our organization is definitely a little bit of an anomaly in the community, in that we are a organization that's based in an Asian community, but our founding was based upon Asians and African Americans and Latino students coming together during the Third World Strike, in the late 1960s, and really fighting for ethnic studies, for greater awareness of our individual histories as communities. And so that's always been the foundation by which my organization, the Japanese Community Youth Council, has operated. And so, today we are very proud of the fact that we serve over 1,000 African American youth every year in our organization. We have African Americans on our board, amongst our staff. And it's a very, I have to be honest, it's a very raw time for my organization right now. And, beyond everything that's going on in the streets throughout this country and throughout the world, we also got news this past week that a former participant of one of our programs was murdered by the police trying to surrender this past week in the Bay Area. So on so many levels, I think I'm personally feeling what's happening right now. And with regard to connection to the film, I think what really struck me throughout the research and production of our film is that in so many ways, it just speaks to how it's been okay in this country to treat certain groups differently, that different groups had different rules, and that you could do certain things to certain groups, and that was allowable. And we've seen that throughout the course of our history. And I think for my the work I do in my day job, I think what I've been acutely aware of is the fact that we're an Asian organization serving so many other communities. Frankly, for many, many years, people found that odd. People didn't understand that. People said, well, you're not really an Asian organization if you're serving all these other communities. And I think we have to, I think this moment speaks to the fact that we have tried to be very powerful allies to other communities, and that hasn't always been accepted. That hasn't always been understood in our Asian communities. And I'm not going to sit here and suggest that we have the answers. We've always done everything right, because I don't think that's the case. But I do think our intent has always been that we, as an Asian community, have to be allies to other communities, and that we have to stand with them when they're the target of oppression and different acts that take place in this country, in the same way that we hoped, in 1942, and I talk about this a lot, is that, the vast majority of this country was silent when our entire community was taken away, and very few, and you saw some of the, I can count on one hand some of the very few people who are willing to stand up to what was taking place right now. And I think that's a very important lesson in our history of complacency. And I think that today, I have to reflect on myself and ask myself when I've been complacent, when I could have spoken up more. And I think this moment in time calls on all of us to think about our own complicity and how we can be more active allies, and how we can speak up more, not just when it's affecting our communities, but when it's affecting all communities.
Thanks, Judd. I would point out, that's a great point that you mentioned about how, there was so little support from anywhere when Japanese Americans were incarcerated in World War II. I would contrast that with what happened about 40 years later with the Vincent Chin case, where Vincent Chin, a young man about to get married, was murdered by a couple of auto workers who blamed him for the way that the Japanese auto industry was making great inroads into our economy and hurting Detroit. When the outcry from the Asian community came up to fight that, we got a lot of support from the Black community and other minority communities in that effort. So that's interesting. But in terms of so speaking out is obviously really important. Is there anything else that we should be doing or working towards? And I would ask Don what he thinks about that.
Well, what we're seeing, I think Kevin referred to this as well as John, and what we're seeing is something that it's really an unprecedented confluence of events. Certainly the George Floyd torture murder, displayed for all to see on video. To me, it reminds me of the 1963 news footage of Bull Connor setting the dogs, the fire hoses, and police baton-wielding police after peaceful protesters. And that changed the conscience of a nation. And then you combine the fact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then within a matter of 3 months, now 110,000 people dead. And you combine that with the gross disproportionate impact on communities of color. I'm sure that's the case in Houston also. And you combine that with just statements from administration about domination and the militarization of the response. Together, there's indication that this is seeping into a mainstream movement. I mean, Black Lives Matter, when it first started out years ago, was kind of regarded as a fringy, kind of left-wing slogan. And now it's moved toward the center. And in the history of the movements in the country, when the impact starts to shift the culture in the middle, and I'm speaking of the white community, and the protests have not just been happening in our urban areas, but have been happening in fairly white suburbs with almost all white protesters. That indicates to me that there's a ground shifting event happening. To Heaven's point, maybe Heaven can comment on this, is we do have a role as Asian Americans in this. Certainly, protest is one form. But in this year, the most consequential year in my lifetime as far as elections are going, where the White House and the state houses and the city councils and all the things that set policy and reiterate the culture of silence that John talked about, that silence equals action in many ways, because obviously when people do not speak out, those who do speak out and control the levers and dials that set policy for society, they win out. So I'll just stop there and maybe ask for Heaven for her input on this question.
Yeah, thank you. So just to touch on that, and something that John said, is that I really think that what we forget as Asian Americans is to speak out internally, amongst each other and amongst ourselves, not because we are the enemy, we want to sow infighting or anything of the like, but we do have this tendency to become complacent and to believe that our privilege and our academic or professional achievements will protect us. But here in Houston, we may have even been even more comfortable than in other places, because it has a reputation for being an energy city, but the greatest volume of jobs is actually in healthcare. If you could drive down to Southwest Houston, you'll see block after block after block of vibrant Asian businesses. We're the fastest growing minority community in the United States. Asians are, and in Houston, we've grown 40% in the past few decades. We have a huge place in this city, but we can't forget just because we're so comfortable, we have access to the best food in local communities and safety amongst ourselves, that we only have the power that is given to us by the status quo. And just like we got to this opportunity, this place in society to be comfortable, it can be taken away like that. And we've seen that, and we're going to keep seeing it unless we say something about it to ourselves. And, Don has said this to me, and it's really stuck with me, but I think change happens locally, and as locally as our own homes. Just imagine what a difference it would make if 20% more of the people thought like we think, if they really took a hard look at their role in complacency and took a hard look at how they got to where they are, as opposed to how the Black or the Latino or the Native American communities got to where they are. And it would be just, a dangerous step close to supremacy and, just eugenics to say that we got to where we are because of our Asianness. That is just not true. We got to where we are because we were allowed to get to the place that we are in society. And if we just think about where that we are here in Houston and how much we could change things, even if we convinced those in our inner circles, if we were that guy on Friday night who ruined a nice time out by not letting comments slide, or if we were that niece or that nephew at Thanksgiving dinner who were willing to take on some challenging hot takes from our family members, if we caused a level of respectful introspection, that we could really change the face of this city and change the face of this state, and that would literally change the face of this country for the future. It wouldn't. Certain beliefs would just go away, and not to get a political platform on a nationwide level forever.
Can I just add 20 seconds to what Heaven just said? I mean, in essence, we have skin in this game. As John film shows, in 1942, the target was Japanese Americans. In 1882, it was Chinese Americans. After the president declared that this is a Chinese virus, more than 1,000 hate crimes, hate-related incidents occurred. The cannon started to be turned against our community. The immigration debate really reflects this. Most Asian Americans are immigrant and born in another country. And that's as a result of the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, which changed quotas into a policy of family reunification and a skills-based preference. So most of our community is beneficiary of that change. Mm-hmm. That immigration policy is now being targeted as chain migration, very pejorative term, and immigration in almost every aspect, including refugees. And again, Asian Americans, particularly in the Houston area and in the South, have benefited from refugee visas. I mean, but for those, literally Americans who are now here would not be here. Their families would be in re-education camps or dead. So this is part of our history. We have skin in this game. We have something to say because we know something about this. And in connection with the overall movement that has been triggered by the George Floyd murder, I think Asian Americans have a role to play, especially locally. Thanks.
Well, now that you brought that up, Don, which are some great points, let me refocus the conversation to Asian Americans. Alternative Facts tells a story about one of the most infamous and egregious violations of civil rights in American history, with the incarceration of Japanese Americans in concentration camps. But, that's just one instance of such a thing going on, of civil rights deprivation and discrimination against Asian Americans in the 170-year history of Asian Americans. When we first started coming to the U.S. And starting probably most famously with the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1800s, and the most recent being, although it pales in comparison in many ways with what's going on with the African American community. Well, but there has been a recent perfect storm of anti-Asian violence, anti-Asian sentiments, which has been occasioned by the COVID-19 outbreak, as well as the China bashing resulting from it and trade wars. we've been consistently treated as perpetual foreigners, throughout our history, and that hasn't seemed to change at all, no matter what has happened in our community. No matter how many generations our families may have been in the U.S., we still get the question about where do you come from, implying that we certainly aren't Americans. I mean, how do we change that? How do we gain acceptance as Americans? Or can we change it?
Well, I'll just share kind of what's on my mind right now with regard to that. And, I've shared this film all over the country, in the South and in the Midwest, on the East Coast, and of course on the West Coast. And I think, I have consistently come across, and frankly, it's most often been Asians who have refuted this idea and this notion that history is repeating itself. And I think in this moment in time, it calls on all of us to reflect on our own communities, our own experiences, and how over time, so many of our communities of color have isolated themselves, have had to fend for themselves. And I think that unfortunately, I've come across many who refute this notion that we are repeating history in so many ways, because of the fact that they are, in fact, treating others the same way that we were once treated. And I think we have to be honest about that fact, that there are many in our communities who are perpetuating much of the white supremacy racism that's allowing many of these things to occur in this country. And I think we have to confront that, and we have to be like what Heaven was saying, we have to be willing to have very difficult conversations around the dinner table and within our communities. And, with regard to my views on what took place during what's happening during the COVID-19 outbreak, is that I think that in many ways we have lost our sense of allyship to other communities. And I think that if we over time had been there more for other communities, they would be there for us. And I think that's the opportunity that we have before us right now. We have an opportunity to stand with another community that is under siege by police brutality, to stand with them and move towards a society where our communities are standing with one another. And I think that will address a lot of the issues that our communities have faced. And, the last thing I just want to say about that is, going back to my nonprofit as an organization, we have some of the oldest and most successful cross-community collaborations because we have stood with each other. And that even though, my organization, the Japanese Community Youth Council, comes from a small community in San Francisco, we're one of the largest child and youth nonprofits for exactly that reason. So I think that's something that I hope that our communities will reflect on, to think about how we can be better allies to other communities, and how we can form lasting partnerships, not just in the short term because of what's going on right now, but really systemically going forward into the future.
John, one quick follow-up question before Don and Heather. You mentioned the reaction you've been getting to your film from other Asian Americans. I'm just wondering too, we know that film can be so powerful and has great reach. And I'm just wondering whether the people who have been making these comments to you, you feel that your film is making them rethink that position and start thinking further, so it's succeeding in what I know that you want your film to do.
Well, I think my goal in making this film was to promote conversations just like this, where we can put issues out, difficult issues to talk about, where we can put them out in front and center in communities, in the Asian communities, but in other communities, so that we can promote dialogue. Because I think that's one of the problems in our country right now, is that we don't have enough dialogue. We don't have enough spaces where people can have conversations about difficult issues and begin to understand different points of view. So I think from that standpoint, it has achieved what I would like it, what I was hoping to achieve. And I hope that it continues to promote this kind of discussion, because I think that's part of our problem in this country is people just want to talk. They don't always want to listen. But I think today, in this moment that we're going through in our country right now, it's really a moment when we need to listen.
Thanks to heaven. Don, what do you think?
So just like a quick anecdote that may be helpful for those of us who are local, because I do really want to emphasize that we have to dispel ourselves of the notion that our Americanness will be the way that we change this. Our projecting our Americanness and our projecting our excellence and success and academic and professional discipline will not save us when the time comes if we need to be saved. The only thing that will be standing together and working with other people who are also facing oppression by the same source. And just to make that salient for those of us in Houston, last year the New York Times ran an article about doctors and researchers across the country who were being investigated for espionage just because they had ties to certain organizations and institutions in China. And so here in Houston, we have MD Anderson, which we tell the world is the leading cancer hospital in the world. This is where you want to be if you have cancer. Houston, Texas at MD Anderson. And here in Texas, the FBI raided the research facilities of Chinese doctors and researchers. Their excellence did not save them. Recently, the administration has announced that they're going to highly monitor, if not ban, certain students, foreign exchange students who have ties to higher education and military institutions in China. Their excellence and their academic achievement did not save them. And that it sounds very similar to me, like how Breonna Taylor's status as an essential worker did not save her. She was even in the safety of her own home, doing absolutely nothing to anyone, and it did not save her. So our silence and our participation in society is not the way that we make change. I wish I had a better map for how it is that we do make change, but I think the one takeaway that I would ask everyone to internalize from here is that when you go home or when you go out and you see your friends who are also Asian American, you feel comfortable that we are not safe just because we have these trappings of privilege.
Couldn't say it any better than that.
Well, I would just point out too, I mean, I think the point about being, we haven't, notwithstanding the trappings of success that Asian Americans have achieved, you're right, it has not made us safe. It has not made us better, and it has not made us been accepted as real Americans. And I guess part of the point is if we can change that for Asian Americans, that might also change, some of these other problems that we face as a community might go away because people won't look at it as foreigners and treat us differently, which, has nothing to do with necessarily, although it could help if our voices in speaking up in support of other communities. But Don, I would also turn to you for your take on the question about, that issue.
Well, what Heaven is talking about is the model minority myth, and our community is very much bifurcated depending upon which particular Asian ethnic group you're looking at. The recent refugees, Hmong Americans, Cambodian Americans, Laotians, and so on, live in some of the toughest circumstances in the most difficult neighborhoods with very much the most limited opportunities, and are facing such things with the policy on immigration that some of them, even though they were granted visas to be in the United States because they fought for America in the quote secret war of the CIA, and when the fall of Saigon happened, were literally running for their lives through boats and refugee camps, and they've earned their right to be in America, paid for in blood, by the way. Now, because of living in a very tough neighborhood, having even a small thing as a drunk driving conviction, face deportation to countries they don't even know. So when Heaven says, that literally we're 1 or 2 degrees of separation from the people being targeted now believe her. I mean, that's exactly right. And Asian Americans, after the Chinese virus thing, really felt the brunt of that and will continue to do so, as the playbook for this coming election seems to be targeting China. And people in America, because of this culture, do not differentiate between Asian Americans and overseas countries. And Japanese Americans know that well. So yes, we have skin in this game. We have a role to play. We need, as John just says, to be good allies. And at the end of the day, it not only helps our own community, Asian Americans, but it makes the country stronger. Mm-hmm. And by the way, democracy itself, because of this playbook of appeals to prejudice, fear-mongering and scapegoating, and then false information, conspiracy theories, that the democracy itself is under pressure. And so we have a role to play in the long-term health of the country as well.
You know, if I can return to heaven for a second and point out something that's probably pretty obvious as people look at us. I don't know about John, I think he might be a little too young, but Don and I certainly are part of the baby boomer generation, which famously is not connecting very well with our kids of the millennial generation, which you are. And I'm just wondering, you know, we have our views, and we are leaving you, your generation, with these problems to solve. And so I'm just wondering, your perspective, you know, how do we approach this? In particular, how are your fellow millennials, from what you can tell, you know, reacting to all of this, and what do you do to encourage them, particularly from the Asian community, to get involved in these discussions that we're having now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm optimistic that, you know, what y'all are saying is right, and that this is a watershed moment, and it will change, because, you know, some stereotypes for millennials exist for a reason, and the number one stereotype for us is that we are entitled. And, you know, I think there's actually a historic and a political reason for that. You know, for us, the first president we could vote for was Barack Obama. I was about to graduate college when the Affordable Care Act passed. I had just graduated law school when gay marriage became constitutionally protected. Like, we came of political age in a time where, you know, the millennial values were on the right trajectory. We were on the up and up. And so we were able to get upset and disenchanted when things that we wanted were not being delivered, like more affordable housing in urban areas, more affordable higher education to participate in the social mobility. These are what we wanted, and now we're unfortunately, but hopefully in a motivating way, being brought crashing down to earth, where we're seeing that the fight isn't about our economic prosperity anymore, or our access to, you know, quality healthcare. It's you know, I'm sure you've all seen the memes. It's about basic dignities and basic safety that some of our fellow Americans are being stripped of. That's what we're back to fighting for now, and that is something that we cannot be entitled about. This is about being able to run down the neighborhood and not be attacked. It's about sleeping in your own bed or having a cell phone at grandma's house. And I think that is waking up millennials. And I'm optimistic. And when we talk about it and such an outrage, that I think that's good. We should be outraged that these basic dignities are being denied. And I think that's why you see hundreds of thousands of us in the street.
Thanks, Evan. I'm being informed that our time is just about up. So I would provide, you know, in 10 seconds or less, I would invite each of you to provide any last comments you might have before we end the session. John, why don't you start?
Sure. I just think that as Asian communities, now in this moment, we have to unlearn a lot of the things that were ingrained in us growing up. I keep thinking about you know, there's this phrase, and I can't even say it, but there's this phrase in the Japanese culture that a lot of our parents grew up with, where, you know, the nail that sticks out gets hit. And as much as we kind of laugh about it, it is ingrained in so many of our Asian communities to lay low, to put our heads down, to be quiet, to assimilate. And that's the way to get by in this country. And I think this moment speaks for us to unlearn that, and to really awaken and raise our voices at a time where other communities, and in particular the Black community, is urging us to do so. And it's really not a time to be silent. It's a time to speak out. And I just encourage my fellow community members to be part of that movement.
Thanks, John. Don.
Well, I'm so encouraged by Evan's comment. I think it's obvious now that this is a global movement, something that has to be addressed not only in the U.S. but also in these other countries. And Asian Americans have something to say about this. We know something about this. So I think, number one, allyship is critical. Number two, Asian Americans can play a role in leading their own community and in leading the public. Why? Because we know something about what's going on. To John's point, we grew up with the saying "shikata ga nai," which is in Japanese means it cannot be helped, and that has to change. We have to play a role in this. Doing nothing is simply not an option. So protests certainly are one thing, being out in the streets, but it's also the nuts and bolts of changing hearts and minds. So that means in your schools, in your community settings like churches and temples, family associations, among your friends and your social networks, to get involved. And I have to say, this is the most consequential election in my lifetime. And again, I'm not just talking about at the national level, I'm talking about at the state and at the city level. So that's where the wheels and the dials and the levers of power are being, that perpetuate systemic racism. That's where it's implementation. That's the wheelhouse. And so important that we get good people in. So please be involved in that.
Thanks, Don. Heaven?
Yeah, so as the one person on the panel not broadcasting from the Bay Area, I feel comfortable saying this without being a bully. For the Houstonians, as a native Houstonian, I really do think that we live in the best city in the country. I love this city so much. We as Asian Americans are the fastest growing immigrant population in the country. We live in the third largest metropolitan area in the country. We live in the biggest city in Texas. If we can change the way that just our immediate circle acts, we can change this city, we can change the state, and we can change the way that this nation looks and acts for the foreseeable future.
Thanks, Evan. One of the things I'd noticed, you mentioned being a lifelong Houstonian and loving your community. And I would just point out that neither John nor Don has gone very far from their roots either. They are, respectively, native San Franciscan and a native Oaklander. And the fact that you guys are so involved in your community, I think, reflects just how much love you have for your community, something that, I really admire greatly. We don't have any questions from the audience, and our time is up. So let me just thank each of you, John, Don, Heaven, for participating in this, and particularly for Happy Fest for having us, and lastly to our audience for bearing with us and listening to us. So thank you all very much. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.